To this point, as we've been learning JavaScript, we have used functions. And we have used what we call a named function. This is the most basic and the most common form of function syntax that you're going to run into as you are developing in JavaScript. So let's do a review of a named function as we've already seen in previous lessons, especially the lesson where we first learned about functions. A named function simply uses the function keyword, which of course tells the engine to go allocate memory and get prepared to store the function parameters and body in preparation to be invoked later on when we need the code. Now, let's remember that functions, what they are actually used for is to help us with the dry principle, or do not repeat yourself. And what it does for us is it wraps code that we would reuse, or code that we might be copying and pasting throughout our application. And we get to take that code, bundle it into a package that we can execute over and over again as needed. So really, functions are just a package of code that we can call at any time in our application for code reuse. And so for a named function, we use function, then we give it a name. So here, we're just going to come up with a contrived example, just a goofy little example here. And we are just going to do add numbers. So add numbers. And after the name of the function, so this is why it's called a named function, we're actually giving a name to the function, a name which we can then recall. We know what it means. We can remember it, it's human readable, and we can execute it when we need it in our code. Then of course we have our parameter list, and then we have our function body. Here in our parameter list, this is where we would take in any data that our function needs to operate, or data that we will be using within our function's operation to generate or create some kind of result that we'd return. And here we're just adding some numbers, so let's do num1 and num2, and let's do num3. We've got 3 numbers that our function takes in. And of course, as the name of our function implies, we're going to be adding those numbers. So let's go ahead and let sum equal num1 plus num2. We want 2 plus num3. And then we of course want to return the results, so we use the keyword return, which tells the engine that once we're done executing all of the statements inside of our function body, so this is a statement right here. And so once we've executed all of these statements in order from top to bottom, left to right, then we can specify what we want returned to the caller of the function. And in this case, we're just going to return the sum, because that's really all our function does. Now, to this point, as we learned when we learned about functions themselves, all we've done is defined a function, this part right here, the body, which has all of the statements, and the return statement that returns whatever we are doing in our function, and then our list of parameters that need to be included for our function to operate properly. All of this just gets stored in memory inside of a variable with the name add numbers that references a function instead of just a value like our variables usually do. So you can think of this as just a variable, like a variable name, but it's really called a function name. But it acts just like a variable that just holds this repeatable code for us. Now, as it executes, this just gets stored in memory and nothing else happens. So if we go ahead and run this program that we have right here, we really don't see any output whatsoever. And that is because all this does is tells JavaScript to go store this in memory and have this function name reference this function in memory for when we need it. So to actually use a function, as we learned, we must call numbers, and then of course we need to pass it what it needs to execute. And usually, since this one returns something, and most of the time our functions are going to return the results of some kind of work, we're going to go ahead and capture the results of this operation. And then we can go ahead and do a console.log. We can log our results to the screen. And now we'll be able to see our function actually execute. So here we can see we've got a 6, which is what it would be expected. We got 3 plus 2 plus 1 gives us 6. So named functions. This should be familiar to you. It should not be anything new. We've already learned about named functions. Now, the next part is an anonymous function. So that's the next type of function definition that we can work with. An anonymous function is a function that does not have a name. So here, if we were to just do an anonymous function, we would say function, and then we would provide the parameter list, and then we would provide the body of our function, or what we want the function to do. And then we would provide our parameters here. Now, funny thing is that anonymous function as just an anonymous function really doesn't do us any good. We have no use for it because we have no name to refer back to it, which means we can't use it. So doing an anonymous function as simply an anonymous function would be absolutely pointless. So where we end up seeing anonymous functions most of the time is in what we call a functional expression, or a function expression in JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out because it will create an error for us, because of course an unnamed function or an anonymous function by itself just doesn't do us any good, so JavaScript will yell at us for that. Where we see anonymous functions right here is when we are defining methods on objects, but also here inside of a function expression. The function expression right here, what we are really doing is, instead of creating a named function where the function actually has a name that points to this, instead we are taking a variable, so let my function equal, and here's where we can use an anonymous function. We can say function, and here we can pass in some parameters. So let's just say your name, and then inside of the body, we're going to go ahead and we are going to return a string, which is hello. Your name is, and then we're just going to go ahead and add to that the your name parameter or argument that gets passed into the function. And so right here, if we run this code, we should see the 6 from our function execution. Up here, we executed the named function. And down here in our function expression, in other words, the variable that now holds this function definition in it, we can now call it just like we would a named function. And we can do that by using the variable name that holds the reference to our function, just by saying let result equal my function, and then we're going to execute it, and we're going to say our name, and then terminate that statement. And then let's do a console.log, and let's log the result of that function call, and then let's go ahead and run our debugger. And here we see number 6 from the named function invocation that we did right here. And now we can see the result of our functional expression being called. And all we did was use the variable name. Now, you might think to yourself, why in the world would I do this when I could just do this and it makes a lot more sense? And the reason is that as you begin to program in JavaScript, you'll begin to find opportunities and situations where defining a function in the global scope of whatever you're working in, so if you're working inside of an object or inside of another function, doing this expressional syntax actually comes in handy. And right now, we're not going to give you any examples because we haven't learned about objects yet. And we're going to be learning about objects in a couple of videos from now. And when we learn about objects, you will get to see where an anonymous function and this functional expressional syntax, or this functional expression syntax, comes in handy when you are defining objects and you are providing methods for those objects. But we'll reserve that once we've learned about objects. So for now, just know that you've got named functions, You've got anonymous functions, which really don't help us unless we use those anonymous functions in functional expressions, or later on when we add functions as methods to objects, which we'll get to soon.